Hi, everyone. Welcome, welcome. So nice of you to make it through the rain and the sun and whatever else is going out there. We heard it really coming down for a bit, so thanks for coming in. I'm Denise Vigno with Howard Center, and welcome to Mindfulness with a capital M. And we're so excited to have Arnie here for the first time. So this is the final in our spring series, the final of 4, and it's been a great spring. So far, we've grown in attendance, we've had really positive feedback, and we will be back in the fall in September, and you can plan on a September, October, November schedule, probably one a month, both probably a combination of film screenings and presentations like this. One of the things I'll just make mention of now, if you have topics you would like to see us bring either next fall or next spring, please make a note on your evals because we absolutely do pay attention to those. So, also in your folders, I just want to mention that obviously there's Arnie's slide deck in there and then some information about him and some information, really resource information, and his website address, which is just chock full of info and resources, so you'll want to take a look at that. Our local Vermont bookseller, Phoenix Books, is here and has several of Arnie's books available post-event in the alcove. So tonight it'll be about an hour presentation, and then we'll open the floor to Q&A. About 30 minutes. We'll end on time at 7:30. One of the things that's really important here is we'll bring around microphones. For those of you who have been here, you know that, but we'll bring mics around to make sure that everyone in the room can hear your question, and also for the video, which will be online within about 2 to 3 weeks. So VCAM, we're so grateful to Bill behind the screen there and Joey in the center. They've sponsored us from the beginning. This is our 4th semester. So thanks, guys, for being here. Thanks also to Hickok and Boardman Insurance, Dealer.com for hosting us. Everyone loves this building, and Main Street Landing. It's my pleasure to introduce tonight's presenter, Dr. Arnie Kozac, here on the right. Arnie is a licensed psychologist and clinical assistant professor in psychiatry at the University of Vermont, Larner College of Medicine. He's a teacher and author, leads workshops across the U.S., and has authored several books, which, again, are available post-event. Arnie has been practicing yoga and meditation for over 30 years, and is dedicated to translating the Buddha's teachings into secular and readily accessible forms. He's also an active outdoor enthusiast, running and boarding the hills of the Green Mountains. So we're so happy to have you here, Arnie. Welcome.
Okay. Ta-da. All right, thank you, Denise, and thank you to Howard Center for inviting me. And we've had a long-standing friendship with the Howard Center, probably going back some 20 years now. So thank you for coming and seeking refuge from the heat, if that's what you're seeking. So tonight we'll talk about mindfulness with a capital M, as opposed to just plain mindfulness, and we'll try to figure that out and see what that might have to do with focus, goodness, and peace for an uncertain world. And there are three points that I'm going to discuss tonight. And the first is that this differentiation between mindfulness with a capital M and mindfulness suggests that mindfulness may be more than just present moment attention, that there's more to it. And in fact, the more that's to it is that it's not just ethically neutral. It's not just you can be attentive to anything, but that there's something about being mindful that propels us or tends to move us towards goodness. That's an umbrella term for a number of specific qualities that we'll talk about. And I'm also going to talk about mindfulness as a disruptive technology. And those of you who work here at Dealer probably know what that means. Sometimes technology is very facilitative. Think of the washing machine. It just helps you to wash clothes faster and easier, right? It helps you to do what you were already doing, but just in a better, easier way. But mindfulness, it can be that, and often I think it's taught like that. But mindfulness actually has a lot more to offer. In fact, it can disrupt the way that we typically relate to ourselves and others and the world around us in what can be a pretty radical way. But rather than just disrupting us, it's going to lead towards sustainable happiness. And so that's something I want to talk about tonight. And that will have something to do with the Buddha's psychology. And so please come on in, find a seat. Welcome. All right. So those of you who know, and I'm going to move around a little bit here. Those of you who know mindfulness, and probably the reason you're here, I mean, everybody's heard of mindfulness, knows something about it. There's really been an explosion in mindfulness, in research. There are hundreds of different research studies being conducted, a lot of them very promising. Explosion in books and publications, journals, and applications. I mean, it really started in healthcare, but now it's spread to education and to corporate settings and even into military applications. And it really has been applied to every conceivable human condition, from stress to psychiatric disorders to medical conditions, chronic pain, you name it, even parenting, pregnancy, and mindful sex. So really it's just exploded in popularity, and with that, some of those cautions that we want to maybe dig deeper into what mindfulness is. And this shows over time, I don't know if you can see that the year by year mentions on Google are exploding. And here's another graph that just shows you that really just big time explosion with that. And Andrew Olendzki, who is a Buddhist scholar and a secular Buddhist, has written, well, there's a considerable enthusiasm for mindfulness these days, as long as it doesn't threaten to make us wise, right? So we maybe start to think about mindfulness with a capital M as having something to do with wisdom as well. Now, my history with this particular practice and tradition goes back to 1989 when I sat what's called a Vipassana retreat, which is a 10-day silent meditation retreat where you do techniques, that might be called mindfulness meditation techniques. We use that term almost synonymously with Vipassana, and we spent a lot of time, first 3 days, just focusing on breathing. And then the remainder of the time focusing on the body, so the breath and the body. And meanwhile, there was no talking or reading or writing or anything. It's a silent, intensive way of learning and focusing on this thing called mindfulness. And back in 1989, it really wasn't a household word. In 2001, I did the Center for Mindfulness Training, and this is the center that Jon Kabat-Zinn founded at the University of Massachusetts Medical School, and now at the medical, well, it was at the medical center, now it's at the medical school, and did some professional training there, and then started teaching mindfulness in the community, and then writing about it as well. So for the last 10 years or so, this has really been the major focus of my professional work in psychotherapy and in teaching, and now in writing and as well. So those are my credentials and why you might want to consider listening to me or not. It's up to you, but you can see what I have to say. So let's get to our first point: mindfulness as present moment attention. So I'll share with you a quote from Rilke, the great poet, Rainer Maria Rilke. And he said in this quote, "The most divine consolation is contained within the human itself. We wouldn't know very well what to do with the consolation of a God. All that is necessary is for our eye to be a trace more seeing, our ear to be more receptive, to allow the full flavor of a fruit to enter us more completely, to tolerate more scent, and in touching and in being touched, to be more present-minded and less oblivious, to receive consolations from our immediate experience that are far more convincing, significant, or true than any suffering that could ever unsettle us." So, certainly an invitation to the present moment, and that being here in the present moment, less oblivious, might have some benefit for us. Jon Kabat-Zinn really is probably the person most responsible for bringing mindfulness into the mainstream. And is that a name that's familiar to people, Jon Kabat-Zinn? I see a lot of heads shaking. So Jon wrote some very popular books. He founded the Stress Reduction Clinic at the University of Massachusetts, as I mentioned. And his definition of mindfulness was paying attention in a particular way on purpose, so being deliberate about how we pay attention, in the present moment, so it's not about future or past, but here in the present moment, and non-judgmentally. Now that term probably needs some unpacking, but because that's important. And also what's interesting about what Jon did is he was a practitioner of Zen Buddhism for many years and also a scientist. And he realized that this practice that he was engaged in, his personal meditation practice, might have benefit for the patients at the medical center, those who traditional treatment might not have been able to help complete, with chronic pain especially. And so that's how it all started. And that was in 1979 when Jon did that. All right, so if mindfulness is just present moment attention, then we have a situation where we could have, please come in, we could have mindful suicide bombers, mindful snipers, mindful psychopaths. Does that feel right? Something about that doesn't quite seem what Jon Kabat-Zinn had in mind when he was talking about mindfulness. And I think that there is a problem, that it can't just be present moment attention, because, let's see, I mean, a suicide bomber could be very deliberate, very focused on the present moment, very, very focused on what they're doing, very committed, and being very non-judgmental about it. They're not questioning, should I do this, shouldn't I do this, is this the right thing? They may just be completely absorbed into that moment. And I think a lot of times, maybe just for convenience, we talk about mindfulness as a synonym for being absorbed, like being highly concentrated, kind of in a flow state. And that's certainly an aspect of it, but it's not, I'm arguing, the whole of it, because otherwise then we have mindful suicide bombers. So here's where the problem may be situated. So mindfulness is the translation of a Buddhist term or a Pali language term from the Buddha's time. It's sati. Now, how do we translate sati? Now, mindfulness is the winning translation of many different possibilities of what could have been translated as, could be the translation of this term. Technically, it means something akin to memory, remembering, right? So mindfulness doesn't really suggest much about memory. And I've written down here on a cheat sheet some of the alternate translations that didn't make it. Intent contemplation, frames of reference, self-discipline. Again, very different connotations from just mindfulness. Continuous awareness, earnest meditations, right? So there are a lot of different nuances, and so again, it suggests that this may be more than just the present moment. I like to think of it as to take in that sense of remembering, that we are aware of ourselves, we're remembering ourselves, and not just in this little confine of the moment, but we're remembering ourselves in larger contexts, in the context of our bodies, in the context of our situation, of culture, society, etc. So we'll come back to that and dig a little deeper, but you know, it might have been very different if another term had come up for mindfulness. And I'll also mention that there is work also over the last 20, 30 years, work done by Ellen Langer at Harvard. She's a social psychologist and she's done research on cognition. And she uses the term mindfulness too, which makes the literature somewhat confusing. You don't know if you're reading about the Buddhist mindfulness or the social psychology mindfulness, which has nothing to do with meditation. It has to do with cognitive flexibility. And we also talk about mindfulness in the literature as a personality trait, that each of us, whether we've meditated or not, might have more or less of this quality of the ability to focus on the present moment, non-judgmentally, and all of that. So, but this we're talking about something different here, and that was the Rilke quote. All right, so we're talking about goodness. That's my thesis here. Now, why isn't the suicide bomber mindful? Well, they may be mindful within the context of an ideology, an idea, right? I think that only works if you have an ideology. You believe that the action you're taking is for a just or legitimate purpose. But of course, that's based on beliefs and speculation and promise of rewards in another lifetime. And so it's really not grounded in reality in the sense that our senses are grounded in reality, as our interactions in the world are grounded in reality. And when we're paying attention to the present moment, we'll probably notice more acutely that our actions, all of our actions and intentions, have consequences, right? The thoughts that we have lead to emotions that we experience, may lead to behaviors. The behaviors we engage in affect the people around us and how they treat us and how they feel. So that part of it gets lost, I think, when mindfulness is being harvested for not beneficial purposes. Those of you who are Marvel fans and saw the movie Ant-Man might remember this scene played by, the character's name was Darren Cross. He was played by Corey Stoll, and he's, the quintessential villain, bad guy, scientist, and he's developing the shrinking technology, and there's some board member who's opposing him, and so he blasts him and he reduces him to a pile of little slime, killing him, obviously. And then he's talking to his girlfriend about gratitude and his meditation. And again, something about that just doesn't seem right, or that we've lost something of the original intention of this, if that's possible. And the idea is, and when we start to talk about goodness, we maybe start to think about morality, and in Buddhism, in traditional Buddhism, it is a system of ethics or morality, and that's been practiced for thousands of years. But it's important to think about this not as a system of, you should do this, you shouldn't do that, this is good, this is bad. It's more along the lines of, if you do these sorts of things, you might find that these sorts of things happen, that if you're killing people, you might find that meditating is actually difficult to do. If you're really paying attention to your actions and the effects of your actions, then we would naturally want to incline towards doing beneficial things, because the other stuff just doesn't feel good. So in some sense, it's really self-serving, that if we want to really experience well-being, then goodness might be a good strategy to embrace. So no killing and then having gratitude. So here, you can be mindful of anger, but not mindfully angry. All right, let's talk about that for a moment. Because when I'm angry, let's say, I get angry, in that moment, I'm really not remembering myself in context. I'm kind of lost to an intense emotion. And, so there's actually, the physiology of emotion is in the body, coursing through my body. There may be behaviors, there may be beliefs. So-and-so did this, or this shouldn't have happened, or I don't like this. And in that moment, I'm not mindful. And believe it or not, that happens on occasion, about every few minutes, in my life. But so anger arises. But when we're mindful, we can notice, that's arising in my experience. I notice I've gone from one place to another, and now I'm angry. And now that's a different experience, because I've pulled myself out of that reactivity that characterizes the anger, the blind reactivity that characterizes the anger, and now I'm regarding it as an object, as a thing. There's anger. And now I can do something that is akin to mindfulness. Okay, so that's a distinction that we can, that there is no, I don't think there's any way to be mindfully angry. And, or any of the other emotions, too. We just substitute different emotions. Uh-oh. What happened here? This is a little faded out. But you can look on your sheets. Maybe it printed out better? I don't know. It was much darker. Can you see that on your... No, it got faded out. Okay. That's weird. Can we drop out of the, maybe the regular, without the slideshow? It might.
Let's see. Why can't I?
All right.
Oh, there. Oh.
It's okay. I'll just describe.
I think I've just advanced.
Yeah,
Okay.
That's fine.
All right.
So, okay. Well, what we have here, you can see it faintly, is that mindfulness, I'm going to redefine mindfulness as a cluster of different qualities. So not just present moment attention, but a cluster of different qualities. So there's a circle in the middle, and that's the mindfulness circle. And then there are 6 other qualities that are often associated with mindfulness with a capital M. Okay? So And these are self-respect. Interesting. I'll just read them out and then we'll go over them. So self-respect, other respect, neutrality of mind, faith or confidence, non-hatred, non-greed. And again, these are translations of Pali language terms, so there are alternate translations for these. So it's a cluster that in any given moment that we're mindful, that all of these would be active in some way. That there's an element of self-respect, that we're not engaging in harming ourselves. Like that incident of anger I was describing, maybe it feels good in some sort of impulsive way, but really it's not beneficial to myself to be angry like that when I really pay attention to it. So we're not engaging in anything that is going to be damaging to ourselves. Other respect, we're not engaging in anything that's going to be damaging to others. So looking for, to see whether any action we take is beneficial or not, conducive or non-conducive towards that sort of benefit. Of course, it's not always clear what the consequences are going to be. Sometimes we don't know, but there's a quality of discernment that when we cultivate this sense of mindfulness, or the practices, the meditation practices, or the other practices that go along with it, help us to be able to discern, is this going to be a beneficial action? Is this a good idea or not? These are sometimes called beautiful mental factors, which is something I like. And this actually comes from an ancient Buddhist psychology, a system of psychology that was developed about 2,000 years ago. And it's just interesting to see how, again, it's not just this unitary thing. So we've got self-respect, other respect. Let's talk about non-greed and non-hatred. Maybe that seems pretty self-explanatory, especially with the anger example, that there's something about greed, desire, sometimes passion, like a blind passion, not our passion of purpose, but just being overcome by emotions. Being in a constant state of desire, appetite, needing things, wanting things. So it's not just necessarily greed, wanting more money. It's just maybe wanting more experiences, just constantly consuming. And hatred is not just hating other people or ourselves. It's another good translation for that is aversion. That we get very caught up on the things that we don't like, and we try to push them away. And we get very caught up on the things that we do like, and we try to reel them in. And we may expend a lot of energy doing that. So if we're not doing that, then we're free to be more aware in the moment, and maybe in ways that are not harmful. Neutrality of mind is sometimes, or is very similar to what we would call equanimity. Equanimity, a quality of being engaged with what is happening without being pushed into reactivity, so that we can be with a very, excuse me. We can be with a very difficult experience without becoming agitated by that. We can just engage with what needs to be engaged with. We can be in the midst of a very happy experience without getting knocked off balance by that. So this neutrality of mind allows us to engage with what is happening. And faith, confidence is more around, geez, this might be a good idea. That if I try these methods, maybe I can get some benefit. So it's not faith in some that requires a belief. And this is what's actually very interesting about the Buddha's teachings, is that they are really very much against belief, against speculation. And his main teaching was, test this out for yourself. Don't take it on anybody else's faith. If you meet the Buddha in the road, kill him. Don't just blindly follow other teachers. Follow your own experience. Pay attention. Figure out, is this beneficial, is this not beneficial? Don't just do it because I said so. Really test this out for yourself. See if that works. And this might be a good time to talk about Buddhism, and what's the difference, and why is that important? And so, just briefly, because I've thought a lot about this, but if we go back, and many scholars are going back and looking at the earliest teachings we have of the Buddha, and these aren't recordings. Obviously, it's 2,500 years ago, approximately, that he was around. It was an oral tradition, so he would give lectures. They would be repeated by the monks and recited over and over again. It was oral for hundreds of years until they were written down about 400 years after the Buddha's death. And we don't have any of those original transcriptions of the oral teachings. But so we don't know. Some of that clearly has been embellished over time. Some of it may be more original, and scholars are trying to figure out, what was the original Buddha? What was he about? What was he trying to say? And this is a very, he grew up, he was living in a very traditional religious context of Brahmanic India, Hindu precursor India, and he really was rejecting that. It's like ritual, belief, metaphysics, speculation, not useful in my experience. And he was a meditation prodigy and a great yogi, and he did all these things, and he found that they were useful, but not entirely so in terms of trying to help him to figure out what's the best way to live life, how do we become sustainably happy. So he was rejecting that. And there is a way to read his teachings, the original teachings, as being very secular, completely secular, psychological even, like one of the first cognitive behavioral psychologists 2,500 years ago. Now, of course, there are other ways to read the Buddha that can become the source of religions, and so it's something of a different emphasis, but it really does seem that he did not want to found a religion. He was interested in self-empowering people to, really to self-empower, to not be reliant on priests, to not be reliant on beliefs, and teaching a methodology based in meditation and a system of ethics that would allow them to transform their lives on their own from that direct, immediate experience. Now that looks a lot different than what the Buddhism you might know from Tibetan Buddhism, the Dalai Lama, or Zen, or Nichiren, or all the variety of different Buddhist traditions that have evolved over the millennia. But that's a different story. But that's not what the Buddha was about. So we can go back to the Buddha as a secularist, as a psychological person, and in a sense, a very modern sensibility. I mean, this is not how people typically thought in the Bronze Age. So the Buddha is a very forward-thinking, radical thinking person. And all right, so let's talk about that. Let's talk about what the Buddha taught. And this will, especially this little poem I'm going to recite now, will probably generate questions. So I will look forward to them when we get to the Q&A section. This is a little poem, Why Are You Unhappy, by Wei Wu Wei, who's actually an Irishman who took on a Chinese name in the 19th century. And so, why are you unhappy? He asks. Why are you unhappy? Because 99.9% of everything you say and everything you do is for yourself, and there isn't one. Everything you, why are you unhappy? Because 99.9% of everything you say and everything you do is for yourself, and there isn't one. There isn't one. So we'll have to unpack that a little bit, I'm sure. All right, so as I said, mindfulness is this disruptive, disruptive technology. It's going to maybe change our lives. So I think about mindfulness as a gateway drug to much harder stuff. Now, again, you can practice mindfulness, 5 minutes at the end of yoga class, help you relax and feel good, but it can also be this gateway to a radical restructuring and reimagining ourselves, the way that we are in the world, the way that we occupy ourself, the way we live within our own skin, the way we interact with people, the way we exist on this planet. So to understand that, we have to understand Dharma. And we've touched on this a little bit. Dharma, Dharma is just it has multiple meanings. One meaning is it's a set of teachings. So in ancient India, these yogis would walk around and say, oh, whose Dharma do you follow? And, I go to Rudraksha, Allah Alarma Kalama over here is one of the teachers Buddha studied with, and I went to this Rudraksha guy, and and people would then say, I follow the Dharma of the Buddha. It's just this set of teachings. Gurus have these dharmas. Dharmas also refer to something more like the way things are. Natural laws, sometimes it's referred to, but we can think of it as the way things work, right? If I hit my thumb with a hammer and I'm going to feel pain, that's Dharma. If I get angry and then the downstream consequences of that's Dharma. There's almost a lawfulness that we can come to understand, a psychology. There's a psychology to being. And if we know that, then we can figure out how to be better, how to live with more happiness. All right. There are not many words on this slide, but this is going to be a little bit of a crash course in the Buddha's teachings. So the four ennobling tasks might not be familiar, but if I said it as the Four Noble Truths, it might be. So the Buddha's first set of teachings is known as the Four Noble Truths. And that's, again, kind of a bad translation of what it actually is in the original. Because truths suggest that, there's something true and false, and, it gets into metaphysics maybe. Noble suggests something elitist and hard to reach, when really we can think about it. You do these things, these are a set of tasks, not beliefs. It's a set of things you do, and if you do them, it will ennoble you. You'll be happier, better, good, be more, a better person. So this is a more secular way of thinking about that, the four ennobling tasks. So I didn't put them in the slide deck, but you can take notes if you like. The first ennobling task, and these are often described in a medical metaphor. So the patient is sick. That's the condition of the human condition. We have some sort of illness that is preventing us from being happy. And so the first task is to figure out what's going on here. What's the condition of the patient? What's the diagnosis, right? We've got to come up with a diagnosis if we want to help this patient. And the Buddha said the diagnosis is dukkha. Now that's a word, and I probably should have written that down, but it's D-U-K-K-H-A, dukkha. It's a word that is most often translated as suffering. Again, that's kind of a limited slice, or just like one part of that experience. Dukkha actually is a metaphor. It doesn't have a one-word translation. And mostly, it literally means like a broken axle. Like an axle that's come off a wheel. And so think about an ox cart back in the Buddha's day, and the wheel is broken. And you're riding on that cart, and it's just the ride is wobbly and uncomfortable and bumpy, and you just can't get comfortable. That there's always something irritating or nagging you, that there's something off about the experience. So it's variously translated as suffering, stress, misery, anguish, dissatisfaction. These are all facets of it, and it covers the whole range from the mildest irritation to the most traumatic thing you can imagine. All right, that's what he's saying. And sometimes Buddhism gets a rap of saying, oh, life is suffering. Life is nothing but suffering, and that sounds pretty pessimistic or nihilistic and not very pleasant, but it's not what the Buddha was saying. He's saying life, if you really pay attention, you'll notice that there's a lot of this dukkha around. Right? I mean, stuff happens, right? We have loss, sickness, old age. We get ill, we age, we die, we experience loss. Elections happen. So those are the big ticket items, but really it's also referring to these more subtle things. And again, coming back to that sense, there's things that I want, but I don't have, and maybe I'm not complete until I have those things, or I have those things, but is it going to last? I don't know. The world's just as things were going to get good, the world's going to fall apart. Or there are things that are here, present, that I don't like, I don't want. I don't want this pain, I don't want this illness, I don't want this situation, this difficult person in my life, or whatever it is. And we're constantly engaged in that pushing and pulling against what's happening in the moment. That's dukkha. That's the diagnosis for the patient. What's the cause of this illness? Well, we've already gotten a clue about that. It's all that pushing and pulling. It's all that restlessness. It's all that non-acceptance of what's happening in the present moment. It's all, sometimes that's called samsara. And again, he used metaphors like he used this term tana, tana, thirst, which literally is thirst, that we can never satisfy that thirst. Because that I, the me, that imaginary self that Wu Wei talked about, always needs something. That we're always engaged in wanting something. And that's not so bad in and of itself, of course. We're biological creatures. We're built, this is the way we're built, to have appetites and avoid painful things and move towards pleasant things. But it's when it becomes contingent, that our well-being becomes contingent on the presence or absence of these things, or the continuity of these things. That's when dukkha is activated. It's not the desire itself, it's when we become dependent on conditions. Now, if you're lucky, you get the conditions exactly right, but usually it doesn't work out that way. And so we always find ourselves in this place of not being too happy with that. So that's, again, just a quick summary of the cause of dukkha. What causes dukkha? Well, something to do with desire, something to do with that pushing and pulling, non-acceptance. The third ennobling tasks is going to be a familiar term, and that's nirvana or nibbana in Pali, right? Nirvana. What's nirvana? I mean, that often is presented as some mystical, blissful experience, but here again, a metaphor. Nibbana means cessation. Like a candle flame goes out or a fire burns itself out. That's nirvana. That's the term the Buddha was using. And he says, if all that pushing and pulling stops, then we are in nirvana. Nothing other than that. Now, that pushing and pulling, the greed, the hatred and the greed we talked about earlier, those are two of the three fires that he talked about. He said the mind is on fire, and he went at great length to use that metaphor to describe our condition that we find ourselves in. And so this greed, this desire, this attachment to things, wanting things is one aspect of it. The aversion, the pushing things away is another aspect of it. The third fire is often translated as delusion, confusion, illusion, intoxication is another interesting. We become intoxicated with this self that needs all these things, and we don't understand how these Four Noble Truths work. That is one of the fires as well. So nirvana is actually the good news about this. Yeah, we can cure this. The prognosis for the patient is good. There's a cure. You can stop doing this to yourself. And of course, it's very self-empowering. It says what you do with your mind, what you do with your body, what you do with your behavior is what determines whether dukkha is active or not. And there is this possibility of no longer engaging in them to kind of dwell in these beautiful mental factors so that you never experience dukkha. And that's what a Buddha is, somebody who's awakened and pretty much lives in that state all the time. For the rest of us, maybe we try to get glimpses of that from time to time. I haven't found that it's possible to live in this world completely dukkha-free, but relatively dukkha-free is probably good. Even brief moments of cessation can be beneficial. The fourth task is known as the Noble Eightfold Path. And here, we can't get into all the 8 aspects, but mindfulness is one of those 8. So it's an important aspect of this is the prescription for the patient. Okay, do these 8 things and maybe you'll be on the right path. And the first 2 are intellectual understanding, wisdom factors. We have to understand how all this stuff works. We have to commit ourselves to doing it, to making the change. The next 3 are ethical factors. We want to be mindful of what we say, what we do, what the work we do in the world. And then the other 3 are meditation factors of mindfulness and effort and concentration. Again, we can't get into all of that tonight, but that is the Buddha's teaching in a nutshell. And that's what he said. I teach dukkha and the end of dukkha. Everything else is a footnote to the 45 years and volumes of everything he taught. This is what he wanted people to understand and to try. And he said, this worked for me. Why don't you try it for yourself? So the 3 hallmarks of existence that I put here are we've already touched on. One of them is dukkha, that we've just talked about at length. The other is, if you want to know the Pali, it's anicca, so that's Anicca. Anicca is easily translated as impermanence. That's why all that desire stuff doesn't work, because we live in this impermanent world, universe. Everything is changing constantly. We can't pin anything down, including ourself, that there's no, and then not self is the final mark of existence. And he was saying that even this self is impermanent. Our self is always changing, but we regard it, we relate to it as if it is solid and stable and stands outside of the flow of experience, having those experiences, rather than just being that experience. And he was saying that's when we become too attached, too invested in that sense of me, and then we're subject to all those contingencies, and we experience a lot of dukkha. So he never said there's no self. Self is just an illusion. But he's saying it probably doesn't make so much sense to invest all this energy into building it up, defending it, aggrandizing it, promoting it. We don't know anybody who does that in a very public way. But, and actually Trump is a very great instructor in that regard. Here's the opposite of the Buddhist not self, inaction. So if you want to learn, we can learn by his bad example. So there's a famous poem, a very lengthy epic poem called the Jin Jin Ming from the 7th century China by somebody called Sang San, which captures what we've been talking about. And he says, "The great way is not difficult for those who have no preferences. When love and hate are both absent, everything becomes clear and undisguised. Make the slightest distinction, however, and heaven and earth are set infinitely apart. If you wish to see the truth, hold no opinions for or against anything. To set up what we like against what we dislike is the disease of the mind. When the deeper meaning of things is not understood, the mind's essential peace is disturbed to no avail." So that, when I say that to my students, what? I have to give up my preferences, I can't like things, I have to can't have desire. Well, he probably meant, it's implied that a great way is not difficult for those who have no attachment to preferences, who don't make their well-being contingent on preferences, whether you get what you want or you don't get what you want. That's where the trouble arises. It's in the attachment. And love here, greed, is another synonym for greed. When love and greed, greed and hatred are both absent, everything becomes clear and undisguised. But as soon as we start, I need, I want, I'm whatever, then that self takes form, and it's that self who experiences the dukkha. All right, I hope that makes sense. We'll come back to that with some questions, I'm sure. Right. So, a lot of what makes us a civilized society requires transcending our evolutionary programming, right? We don't run around, marauding and pillaging and beating people up, typically in civilized society. We learn to control our bodily functions. We do all sorts of things that distinguish us from our animal, well, we're all animals, but our less civilized ancestors. okay? And the Buddha's teachings, I think, are really the next set of things to transcend, that it's possible, that, all this desire stuff is built into us by evolution. Just the consequence of being an embodied, embrained creature, living in a world that has physics and all that stuff. There's nothing bad about it or evil or anything like that. It's intoxicating. It can be very distracting and can take us over. So it's possible to, transcend our stories, all that internal storytelling. So when we're not in the present moment, we're fantasizing about the future, wondering, what's going to happen? Am I going to get what I want? Is it going to work out? Am I going to be okay? Or we're storytelling about the past. So this is, why did I say that? Why did I do that? I should have done this. All of that language-based, our identity, that sense of the sense of self arises out of our investment in language. So that doesn't mean we give up language and become mute, but to see how dukkha arises out of our storytelling, or out of our attaching labels to things, and all of these things that I've put up here, and we won't be able to get into all of them, but what's interesting is that the Buddha anticipated a lot of the findings of evolutionary psychology and neuroscience and cognitive science, this sense that there's an essential self, there's a me somewhere in there who's running the show, pulling all the levers and making all these decisions and doing all these things. They can't find it. We think we're in control, but mostly we're unconscious. This is very clear. The findings of cognitive science show we're enormously unconscious. And this idea that there's like a CEO running, I am like the CEO of myself, I'm the president of myself, I'm making all the decisions. Maybe it's more like I'm the press secretary trying to make sense of what actually happened, hiding in the bushes. So all of that stuff. So this is really, I think, the next frontier of our evolutionary process is to not to get rid of these things, but just not to be so beholden to them. Actually, I have more to go here. So, all right. So selfishness is not a strategy for sustainable happiness. That's the upshot of this, because all that investment in self and what I want and what I need just makes us very self-preoccupied and doesn't seem to lead to happiness. And there's a lot of research that's coming out now out of positive psychology that supports that notion. Now, the Buddha had 4 recommendations for attitudes or behaviors or activities that would be more conducive to sustainable happiness. And these are sometimes called the limitless abodes or the Brahma Viharas, and it's kind of been idealized in some ways, but I call them the 4 approaches. An approach in the sense of here's a method to do it, but also in that sense that these are approach states. When we're feeling safe and open, we approach. We approach other people, we approach experiences, we're much more open and approaching. So these are states, and here are the Pali terms for those, metta, karuna, mudita, and upekkha. So let's talk about these briefly. Metta is translated as loving kindness, loving friendliness. Okay, you may have heard of this. It's also becoming more and more popular. This is not a romantic love. It is a, love without attachment, and it starts with ourselves, and it's then given to others. So if we live in the world, if we cultivate this quality, that might be a beneficial thing. The interesting thing about metta is that it is not contingent. It's not, okay, I'm going to be loving and friendly to the people who are nice to me only. It's the intention is to do it to everyone without exception, without condition. Undeserved, whether it's deserved or not, that's the idea, to just be open like this. Karuna is compassion, same deal. Let's not, when it's not like I'm going to be compassionate to, only the people who, have suffered natural disaster. I got to be compassionate towards the evil ones too, or the misguided ones. So and compassion is not just empathy, not just feeling the pain of the other, but it's really having a wish to help, to heal, to ameliorate, to alleviate that sense of dukkha, right? And these come from a place of wisdom too, sense that, all right, I've noticed that this is beneficial. When I'm caught up in dukkha, I do all sorts of things that I regret. And I see people around me doing like really things that I can't understand or that are difficult or bad or harmful or who knows what. And the idea is, well, they're just caught up in the fires. They're out of control. And they're probably suffering, right? Do we really think that the Donald is really happy? Sitting alone, eating his hamburger in his room? Writing tweets, angry tweets? I don't know, maybe, but maybe not. So we could be compassionate towards him. This one, mudita, appreciation, sympathetic joy, is the opposite of Schadenfreude. So instead of rejoicing in the difficulties of your enemies, being happy for people's success. But more than that, it's appreciation, really appreciating, and then it goes into gratitude, just appreciating whether it's somebody else's good fortune or our own good fortune, just appreciating the being alive. So this is another quality that is beneficial. And then here we are back to equanimity, that neutrality of mind that, again, kind of doesn't fit with the others because the others are all kind of these positive states. This is more neutral, but again, he felt this was a very important way of being, and often is seen as a byproduct of practicing mindfulness. So these are the four approaches. All right. Well, we're back to the slide that we can't see, but mindfulness is a cluster of activities, not just one thing. And we've kind of, so let's think about it as remembering ourselves in context, sati, remembering ourselves. This DMN stands for default mode network. That's what's activated in our brains when we're daydreaming, when we're ruminating, when we're thinking about storytelling about the past and the future. There's some interesting work showing that's a part of our brain that's activating. Sometimes, I think we can sometimes live our entire life or large portions of our life just in that context, stuck inside our heads, storytelling, lots of dukkha. So we practice mindfulness. We now are in the context of the body. It's this very body-based practice. We're paying attention to breathing. We're in the body. We're not so beholden to those stories any longer. And that, for a lot of people, seemingly, that's what mindfulness is. Present moment attention in the body, feeling good, less stress, so forth. But we're going beyond that to the ethical context, that mindfulness is goodness. It's not just feeling good for myself, but really appreciating myself in the larger context of my own well-being, the well-being of others, the well-being of my community, the well-being of the planet, and so forth. And then we can just keep going. The context of the vast. I like to think about this as well. You know, being here in Vermont, we have the privilege of tasting that vast. I'm always, you know, just my breath taken away for a second every time I see the mountains. Like, wow, they're really big. You know, they tend to shrink in my memory and just, you know, get lost. But then there it is, that sense of the majesty of the mountains or the lake or the ocean or is all, you know, the cosmos, the stars, even our own bodies are embodiments of the vast. This one little neuroscience fact that if we take, you just unwind, unspool all of our neurons in our brain, those 80, 100 billion neurons, 50 million miles of wiring up here. It's just staggering, just impossible to consider. So that's the vast. All right. We'll conclude the talking part with one of my favorite poems and popular poem on the mindfulness circuits, Love After Love by Derek Walcott. And then why don't we actually just do a few minutes of practice and then we'll go into questions, okay? So, the time, you know, it's delayed onset puberty. It's a problem. The time will come when with elation you will greet yourself arriving at your own door, in your own mirror, and each will smile at the other's welcome and say, sit here, eat. You will love again the stranger who was yourself. Give wine, give bread, give back your heart to itself, to the stranger who's loved you all of your life, who'd be ignored for another who knows you by heart. Take down the love letters from the bookshelf, the photographs, the desperate notes. Peel your own image from the mirror and sit, feast on your life. Sit and feast on your life. So why don't we just take a moment before we go into questions to just sit with that sense of the words of the poem and the other words shared here. And just feel all the thoughts and emotions that are present. And to feel the breathing that's happening right in the center of our bodies. And letting go of pursuing any thoughts about the future or the past or opinions about the present, liking and disliking, and just see if we can rest into this moment with the breath. And here we are, sitting in our bodies, sitting in a chair, sitting in this room with others, sitting in this community, in the world outside, in this vast universe. Okay, thank you for your attention, and we'll move into questions now. And we'll bring microphones up for folks who have questions. Yes, we have somebody here. I'm not sure if we're on. Green light. Okay. You have to hold it down until it goes all green.
I have a steady green light. First, thank you.
You're welcome. Thank you.
This is a very complex, huge concept to get across in a few words and a few bit of time. So my question, some of your concepts you had quite clearly delineated in that outline, and there was one or maybe two that I tried to take good notes, but I kind of missed the big idea. And it was on page 4 of the handout, Sustainable Happiness, the 4 ennobling tasks. Mm-hmm. So the 3 fires exactly are what? And the 3 hallmarks of existence are exactly are actually what?
Yeah, I realize I probably should have enumerated those. And anybody who wants more details, I can just email me and I'll send you more detailed notes. But let's go over those again. So the 3 fires are greed and hatred, the pushing and pulling, and this other term which sometimes gets characterized as delusion. That's a very strong term. Sometimes confusion, I think, is better. Ignorance is another popular way of translating that we're ignorant of what? Well, we're ignorant of the downsides to the other 2 fires. We don't understand the way the 4 noble truths work, the 4 ennobling tasks. We think that there's this solid sense of self when that's not actually there. One of my Buddhist scholar friends likes intoxication, and moha is the term, M-O-H-A, moha is the 3rd fire, and it's like intoxication. We're just intoxicated with ourselves, intoxicated with identity and power and desire and all of those things. And we just kind of, have a bad case of the munchies, and we just want to fill that. And these lists are, the Buddha was big on making lists, partly because of the oral tradition. And if you read the sutras, the discourses of the Buddha, it's very boring because it's repetitive, highly repetitive, because it was memorized. Better to read them as, somebody who's distilled it for you. And I just lost where I was going with moha. The intoxication, but something about going back to the sutras. But lists. Why there are lists? The Buddhists love lists. So there's the 3 fires, the three hallmarks of existence, the Eightfold Noble Path, the Four Noble Truths, 4 foundations of mindfulness, 7 factors of enlightenment, goes on and on. And some of these overlap with each other. So dukkha shows up on the Four Noble Truths, and it also shows up on the 3 hallmarks of existence. These are like just the qualities that he noticed are the most relevant. And that sense of dukkha, something is off. This, that quality of that we talked about. Then there's impermanence, that things are just constantly changing. And that probably has something to do with why we have dukkha. And then anatta is or anatman in Sanskrit, is the other hallmark, and that's the not self. Sometimes translated as no self, sometimes translated as not self. And again, that's a direct reference to the Vedic notion of self. So if you want me to get into that, I can explain that. But he really was saying, just pay attention to your immediate experience. Work with that. Don't speculate. Don't worry about heaven or a soul or anything. Work with what you can think and feel and do. That's what he was saying by anatman. So these things, they overlap quite a bit, or interlock with one another. But that's the core of it. It's the central core. And you'll find those teachings in all the Buddhist traditions, but this is the original psychological stuff before it got pulled into religions and ritualized and all of that.
Hi. I have 2 questions. One is, with your practice of meditation and mindfulness over the years, have you found any changes in one's conception of the movement of time? And the other question is, I've looked into the Shambhala Center, the Zen Center, and unfortunately they all burn incense, which I cannot be near at all. Does anyone in the area teach this, or the practices that do not burn that? Those are my questions. Thank you.
Okay. Well, let me start with the incense first. My colleague, Nina La Rosa, has a meditation studio just a few blocks from here in the Kilburn Gates building, Still Point Center, and she's just coming out of maternity leave and starting the public meditations again, but I don't believe she burns incense. So that could be a good place to start. Time. Well, time is so interesting. I'll tell you one little story. I was meditating some years ago at not the Vermont Zen Center, but another Zen Center out in East Calais, and I was expecting to sit for an hour, and then seemingly a few minutes later, the bell rang, and I'm like, oh, something must be wrong, and I don't know, something must have happened. But no, it was an hour. And I wasn't asleep, but I was just in a state where time no longer exists. Most days when I'm practicing and I'll set my timer for an hour and sit for an hour. Not probably the way to start. Start with 5 minutes, something more approachable. And and sometimes that hour goes by very quickly, and sometimes there's a little demon inside of me saying, okay, it should have been about like 27 minutes by now, and God, when is that bell going to ring? And it's just like, so it varies quite a bit. And going on retreat is time, that will really alter one's conception of time. It's just incredible how long a day is when we don't have all the distractions that we usually have. And also, sometimes those days go by in a flash. So it really varies. But time is, and we can also meditate on What is that restlessness, that impatience that accompanies the marking of time? And of course, we can only mark time by referencing the future and the past and then internal commentary. And when we let that go, then time just kind of flows. There's no self there to say, okay, it's this long. So then time flies. I know I wasn't that lucid that there are no questions.
Thank you. I'm not quite sure how to put this. The idea of greed and desire, I understand those only too well sometimes. And in my gathering of over my life, never studied formally, but I have this understanding of for myself the idea of longing. And I think of perhaps longing, at least my working definition is like a non-attachment to the innate sense of wanting, but then again, I'm having to use the word want in there. Any thoughts? Can you help me?
Yes, well, I think I understand what you're getting at. So there is an exception here. So if we're supposed to jettison all desires, right, and that's sort of a caricature of the practice. It's really not, but yeah, not being attached to those desires, not being beholden to them, defined by them. But there are some desires that are not only good but necessary. You have to have a desire to transform yourself. You have to desire to overcome all those evolutionary tendencies that are built into us, and that takes quite a bit of effort and commitment, and that's captured in the Eightfold Path under what we could call resolve, right resolve, or beneficial resolve, that the desire to awaken can be beneficial. It could also just be caught up in the whole wanting thing too. Oh, I want to become a great yogi, and just that becomes our self-identity gets woven into that. But there is this kind of, if you want to call it longing or a non-attached desire to pursue, to consider and to pursue this idea of awakening. And we didn't really talk about awakening, but oftentimes nirvana may be a synonym for awakening. And what does Buddha mean? It means Buddha, one who has experienced Buddho, which simply means awakening, like waking up out of a sleep. It's another metaphor. Buddho, it's not some mystical, esoteric thing. It's really just waking up. And oftentimes the Buddha's experience is described as enlightenment, which is a more mystified, saintly view of the Buddha, but really it's awakening. Very ordinary. But to want to awaken, we have to work with our psychology in this way. Recognize dukkha, address the causes of dukkha, practice so that we can experience moments where we're not overcome by dukkha, and maybe ample doses of mindfulness is part of that. It's going to be part of that. Meditation practice for most of us is the way that happens. So great question, important question. We had a question here. Actually, there's a woman up front here. I will come back to you, Jay.
I recently read an article about mindfulness. Now, I think mindfulness is extremely useful, but the article was saying that this person felt that it was an elitist practice, that after all, the Buddha all he had to do was wander around with his bowl and have some rice, and he was not the one that had to winnow and so forth. And what about if I'm a fry cook at McDonald's and I'm on my 200th order now? What,
Yeah.
you know, how can I deal with that?
There's a couple of good, important points in what you bring up. So, is mindfulness and Buddhism, mindfulness with or without Buddhism, an elitist enterprise in the United States? Absolutely, no doubt about it, and for a variety of reasons. Just to go on retreat is expensive. I mean, a lot of places offer scholarships, but in traditional Buddhist settings in Asia, and in some places here in the States, there's no charge. It's not supposed to charge for the Dharma. You're supposed to give what you can. It's a principle of generosity, or dana. But that's not practical, maybe in capitalism always. But actually, Vipassana meditation centers that were founded by S.N. Goenka, I still don't think they have they've suggested fees, but they don't actually charge. So that's something that we really have to address, to make the Dharma available to everyone. And I actually have an idea for a book I want to write called NASCAR Dharma, because if the teachings aren't useful for the fry cook or for somebody you wouldn't think is interested in yoga or meditation, then they're really not doing what they're supposed to be doing. And what was the other? There was another point I thought I would. Oh, right. Yeah. So, right. So this is not so much elitism as monasticism. So the Buddha realized that living in the world is tough. I mean, he'd done that for 30 years or so. A lot of temptations, a lot of distractions. So if you really want to get serious about this, they created monastic communities so that you could just focus on the practice. And yeah, that in some ways you're alleviated. You have the luxury of doing that. And in other ways, I mean, I think what I really appreciate about mindfulness practices is that they're portable and durable. And so it's possible for the fry cook or for the busy doctor or the whatever it is that you're doing in the world to bring the practice there. You don't need the monastic life to become awakened. And there were lots of people in the Buddha's time who weren't monks or nuns who did. And he said, there wasn't one or two, there were, scores and scores of them. So it is possible, and it has to work like that, because if you can only awaken as a monk, then, that's not going to be very useful. Jay, did you?
Thank you for sharing with us tonight. I recently was talking with a young millennial, and he was very proud and excited to share with me how he wrote for himself and his children a letter of where they'd be in 10 years from now. And it gave me cause to reflect. I really didn't respond, but I thought a lot. For one to write a goal in terms of where they'll be 10 years from now, I thought of the impermanence of life. I thought of not pulling something towards you or pushing it away. Where is that considered dukkha, and where is goal setting considered to be okay?
Right. Okay. So, right. So if we're always living in the present moment, then how do we plan for the future? But planning for the future can be a deliberate activity in the moment. So goal setting, that's my action of the moment. I'm going to set some goals. And, again, it's always looking out for attachment. So if we set goals and say, well, I need to achieve this or else I'm not a good person or I'm a failure, then that sets us up for a lot of dukkha. But if we set our sight on this seems like a valuable goal, and I realize, intellectually there's a piece, the wisdom piece is like, oh, I don't know. Who knows? The world could fall apart. I could get sick, distracted. There's a million things that could happen. So all I can do is make my best effort. And in that is, some preparation for impermanence or non-attachment or acceptance of what, the path might be like. But again, it's the contingency. A lot of times we set goals or we do things for ourselves because we think that's going to make us okay. And if those goals also, we know if they have intrinsic value, that they accord with our own values and strengths, that they're more likely to lead to happiness than ones that we're doing for external reasons, for extrinsic reasons, like, oh, this will make me look good, or this is what other people expect of me. So when they come from within, without attachment, then we can pursue them, I think, without dukkha, like the goal of awakening. Let's just, I want to awaken, that's a goal. So I have no attachment to that, because otherwise it would be a lot of dukkha. I think, Denise, we're I think at our conclusion. One more question, is that okay?
The clock's a little fast anyway.
In terms of saying awakening, so is there a belief that we have it in us, like we're born with?
Yes. So, awakening is, in a lot of, yes, it's almost something, we don't do it, we just remove the conditions that keep us from realizing it. That all you have to do is stop the fire, put the fires out, and then we're awakened. So it's not something you have to do, you have to go out. It is believed to be innate, natural, in some sense. Not in an evolutionary sense, but it is, it's there, available to all of us, without regard to education or socioeconomic status or anything else, that it's always there and available. So.
Yeah, like in the sense, somebody has a traumatic event in life or life-altering event, and they say they were awakened to their...
Yeah, it can be. Anything can trigger that. Something sudden or just the gradual work of getting on the cushion, practicing goodness. There's lots of ways. So, great questions. Thank you for your questions. Thank you for your presence and attention, and enjoy.
Thank you, Arnie, very much. Thank you all for coming. If you'd be kind enough to fill out evaluations, there's a box right down on the first step by the water. And be on the lookout. We'll let you know about our fall series. Enjoy the summer.